The river had brought him. That was the first strange thing, because the river running past Briar's cabin was shallow and slow this time of year, barely enough to carry fallen branches, and yet somehow it had carried a man. She found him at dawn, face down in the reeds where the current pooled before bending east, his dark hair matted with blood and silt. One arm twisted underneath him at an angle that made her stomach turn before she'd even reached him. She almost didn't touch him. Almost. 9 years of living alone at the edge of Thornwick territory had taught her that strangers who washed up half dead usually brought trouble behind them, the kind that didn't knock politely before it arrived. But he was breathing. She saw his ribs move once, shallow and slow, and something in her, the same something that had made her mother a healer before her, wouldn't let her walk away from that. "Don't be dead," she muttered, rolling him onto his back with more effort than she expected. Because he was enormous, easily twice her weight, all muscle and old scars. And getting him even partway up the bank took the last of her strength. He wasn't dead. He also wasn't in any shape to explain himself, which was probably for the best, because the moment Briar got a proper look at him in the gray morning light, she understood exactly how much trouble she'd just dragged out of a river. The wounds weren't the ordinary kind. A gash across his ribs had the clean, deliberate look of a blade rather than an accident, and there was a puncture wound just below his collarbone that looked like it had come from something with more precision than a fall down rocks. Someone had done this to him on purpose. Someone had wanted him dead badly enough to leave him bleeding in a river and not bother checking whether the job was finished. She should have gone to the village. She should have told the watch. Let them handle it. Let someone with more authority than a solitary herbalist decide what to do with a half-drowned stranger who smelled like trouble. Instead, she spent the better part of an hour dragging him, inch by exhausting inch, up the muddy bank and through the trees to her cabin, sweat soaking through her dress despite the cold, cursing under her breath the entire way. "You'd better be worth this," she told him, though he couldn't hear her, his head lolling against her shoulder as she half-carried, half-dragged him through her own front door. Getting him onto the bed took longer than she wanted to admit. He didn't fit properly, his legs hanging off the end, and she had to prop his shoulders up with every spare pillow and folded blanket she owned just to keep his breathing steady. When she finally got his shirt cut away, the sight of him made her pause despite herself. Not out of anything improper, just the sheer scale of the damage. Bruising bloomed dark and deep across half his torso. The rib wound needed stitching. The puncture below his collarbone had gone in at an angle that made her worry about what it might have nicked on the way through. "This is going to hurt," she said quietly, threading a needle with hands that had gone steady the way they always did once the work actually started, no matter how badly they'd been shaking a moment before. "I'm sorry in advance." He didn't wake for the stitching, which was a mercy, though he groaned once, low and involuntary, when she packed the puncture wound with the yarrow paste her mother had taught her to make years ago, back when Briar was young enough to think her mother would always be there to teach her the next thing. It took 3 days for him to open his eyes. Briar had almost given up hope by the second night, sitting beside the bed with a bowl of broth going cold in her hands, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and wondering what exactly she was going to do if he simply never woke up. Burying a man his size would take most of a week. Explaining a dead stranger to the village watch, if they ever found out, would take considerably longer and end considerably worse for her. But on the 3rd morning, as pale light came through her one good window, his eyes opened. They were a strange color, gray shot through with something warmer underneath, like storm clouds with the sun still trying to burn through, and for a long moment he simply stared at the ceiling without blinking, his breathing too fast, his whole body rigid the way an animal goes rigid right before it decides whether to fight or flee. "You're safe," Briar said carefully, staying where she was, not reaching for him. You're in my cabin. I pulled you out of the river 3 days ago. You've been unconscious." His head turned, slow and careful, and those gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to lean back, though she made herself hold still. "Who?" he said, and his voice came out wrecked, barely more than a rasp. "Are you?" "Briar." She kept her tone even, the same tone she used on frightened animals and frightened children, the tone that said there was no immediate reason to be afraid even when there probably was. "You don't have to tell me your name yet. You don't have to tell me anything yet. Just breathe." He didn't breathe easy. His jaw worked, and his eyes moved around the small room, cataloging exits. Cataloging her, cataloging the distance between the bed and the door, and Briar understood with a cold, sinking certainty that whoever this man was, he had spent a long time somewhere that had taught him to always know where the exits were. "Someone tried to kill you," she said, "because it seemed pointless to pretend otherwise. Whoever did it left you for dead in my river. I don't know who you are, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know, because knowing things like that tends to be dangerous around here. But I've kept you alive for 3 days, and I'd like to keep doing that, if you'll let me." Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like disbelief, like he wasn't accustomed to anyone offering help without wanting something in return. "Why?" he asked. "Would you do that for a stranger?" Briar considered the question longer than it probably deserved. "Because nobody did it for me once, when I needed it," she said finally, "and I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be the reason that happened to somebody else." He didn't answer that. His eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him back under. And Briar sat with the cooling broth in her lap and wondered, not for the first time since she'd found him, exactly what kind of trouble she had just chosen to keep. He slept through most of the following week, waking in short stretches, just long enough to swallow broth or answer a question with the fewest words possible. Briar learned almost nothing about him in those early days except that he was stubborn about pain, refusing to admit how much any given movement hurt, and that he watched her hands whenever she worked on his wounds like he was memorizing the shape of her competence. "You've done this before," he said on the 5th day, his voice steadier now, though still rough at the edges, "not just on me. My mother was the village healer. I learned at her elbow since I could hold a needle." Briar didn't look up from the bandage she was rewrapping around his ribs. "She died 4 years ago. I took over, mostly, though the village prefers to pretend I'm just her assistant still, filling in until someone properly qualified comes along. Why would they think that? Because I'm a woman who lives alone at the edge of the territory and doesn't have a mate or a pack rank worth mentioning, and people around here have very particular ideas about who gets to be trusted with important things." She tied off the bandage and finally met his eyes. "You don't strike me as someone from around here, if that helps narrow anything down." He didn't answer that either, which by now she'd started to expect. Whatever he was hiding it carefully, weighing every word before it left his mouth, the way people did when the truth was dangerous enough to get someone killed. "What should I call you?" Briar asked. "If not your actual name." He considered this for a long moment, his jaw working the way it always did before he said anything he'd clearly rehearsed. "Ronan," he said finally. "It's not my name. It's just not all of it. That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." His gray eyes held hers, steady despite everything. "I'm not trying to insult you by keeping things back, Briar. I'm trying to keep you safe from things you don't want any part of." "A little late for that," she said dryly. "I already pulled you out of a river with a blade wound in your ribs. I think I'm already part of whatever this is, whether either of us likes it." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face, quick and gone before it fully arrived. Fair enough. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had chosen, but both seemed to accept. Briar tended her small garden of herbs in the mornings, checked on the handful of village patients who still trusted her enough to come to her door, and returned each afternoon to find Ronan a little stronger than the day before, sitting up now instead of lying flat, his color coming back in slow degrees. He was terrible at sitting still. She learned this quickly, the way he'd shift his weight the moment her back was turned, testing his own limits before his body was ready for them, wincing and pretending he hadn't. By the second week, he'd taken to pacing her small cabin at night when he thought she was asleep, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, like a caged animal working through something it couldn't put into words. "You're going to tear those stitches," she told him one night, catching him mid-pace, arms crossed, unimpressed. "I need to move." I've spent 2 weeks lying in a stranger's bed doing nothing but healing. It's not natural. It's exactly natural. It's called recovering. She gestured at the chair by the fire, the only piece of furniture in the cabin that could hold his weight without complaint. "Sit. Talk to me instead. If you're not going to tell me who you are, tell me something else." "Anything." He sat, reluctantly, the chair creaking under him, and for a long moment he simply stared into the fire, the orange light catching the sharp planes of his face, the scar that ran along his jaw that she hadn't asked about yet. "I used to know exactly what I was supposed to do every day," he said finally. "Every hour, practically, there was always a decision waiting, a report, a border dispute, a problem only I was supposed to be able to solve." His hands, resting on his knees, curled slightly. "I haven't had an hour with nothing required of me in longer than I can remember. It's strange. I don't know what to do with it." "You could learn to just exist for a while," Briar said. "Most people manage it. Most people didn't have my life." "No," she agreed. "But you're not living that life right now, are you? You're living in a healer's cabin at the edge of nowhere, with nothing required of you except getting better. Maybe try it. See how it fits." He looked at her then, something searching in his expression, like he was trying to work out whether she meant it as comfort or challenge, and she supposed it was probably both. "You're not what I expected," he said, when I opened my eyes and found a stranger stitching my ribs. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd want something from me the moment they realized what I was worth." His voice had gone quieter. "Everyone always wants something. It's the first thing you learn in the life I had. Nobody helps you without calculating what they'll get back." Briar considered that for a moment, the fire popping between them, and found she didn't have anything clever to say to it, only the truth. "I don't know what you're worth," she said. "I only know you were bleeding in my river, and now you're not. That's enough for me right now. The rest can wait until you're ready to tell it." The trouble arrived on a gray afternoon in the 3rd week, in the form of 6 armed riders wearing the black and silver of Thornwick's standing guard, moving slow through the village square, asking questions of anyone who'd stand still long enough to answer them. Briar heard about it from old Mabel, who ran the bakery and knew everything that happened within a day's ride before most people had finished their morning tea. "Looking for deserters," Mabel said, kneading dough with more force than the recipe strictly required. "Or, that's what they're saying. Somebody important went missing from the border campaign a few years back, and now suddenly the steward's men are combing every village from here to the coast asking if anyone's seen a large stranger with a scar down his jaw." Briar's hands went very still around the jar of dried chamomile she'd come to buy. A scar down his jaw. That's what they said. "Why, you seen someone matching that?" "No," Briar said, too quickly, and hoped Mabel was too distracted by her dough to notice. "Just seems like an odd thing to be hunting for, after all this time. Steward Varric's men don't explain themselves to the likes of us. Mabel shrugged, already moving on to the next piece of gossip, something about a disputed grazing fence 2 farms over, and Briar left the bakery with her heart hammering and her mind racing through every possible way this could go wrong. She didn't tell Ronan right away. She spent the walk home rehearsing how to bring it up, weighing whether telling him would help him or simply frighten him into doing something reckless before he was strong enough to survive the consequences. And by the time she reached her own door, she still hadn't decided. He knew anyway. He always seemed to know things before she said them. Some instinct honed by years of a life she still didn't fully understand. "Riders," he said. The moment she stepped inside, his body already tensed in a way she'd learned meant danger. "I heard the horses from here, 6 of them, moving slow, methodical. That's a search pattern, not a patrol." "They're asking about a man with a scar down his jaw," Briar said, watching his face carefully. "Missing from a border campaign a few years back." The steward's men. Something went very cold behind Ronan's eyes, an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Old and weary and furious all at once. "Varric," he said, quiet and flat. "You know him. I know him better than anyone alive should have to." Ronan's hand went unconsciously to the scar along his jaw, tracing it the way a person traces an old wound they've stopped noticing until someone else points at it. "He's not looking for a deserter, Briar. He's looking for confirmation that I'm actually dead. Because as long as there's any chance I'm not, his entire position remains a lie standing on borrowed time." Briar sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her mind working fast, trying to fit the pieces together into a shape that made sense. "You're not a deserter." "No. Then what are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the sound of the search party's horses long since faded from the road outside, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone hollow in a way that told her whatever came next had cost him something significant to say out loud. 3 years ago, I was ambushed on the northern border during what was supposed to be a routine inspection of the frontier garrisons. He said, "My own second-in-command led me into it. I was told later that my body was recovered and burned according to custom, that the entire territory mourned for a season, that my cousin Varric assumed the regency because there was no other bloodline close enough to hold the throne steady." His jaw tightened. "None of that happened the way it was reported. I survived the ambush, barely. I spent the better part of 2 years being kept somewhere I won't describe to you, somewhere designed to make sure I either died quietly or lost enough of my mind that returning wouldn't matter even if I escaped." Briar's stomach had gone cold somewhere around the word ambush, and it hadn't warmed since. "But you escaped." 3 months ago. I've been moving since, trying to find someone I could trust enough to help me gather proof, someone Varric's people hadn't already bought or frightened into silence. I was close to the border when his men found me again. That's how I ended up in your river. The fire popped. Outside, an owl called once, distant and unbothered by any of it, and Briar sat very still, trying to absorb the shape of what she'd just been told, that the man sleeping in her cabin for 3 weeks, the man whose wounds she'd stitched with her own 2 hands, was not simply a stranger with dangerous enemies. "Who are you?" she asked, though some part of her had already guessed the answer, had probably guessed it the moment she'd seen the quality of his scars and the particular way he carried authority even flat on his back in a healer's cot. "Ronan Ashvile," he said, "Alpha King of Thornwick. Presumed dead for 3 years by everyone except the man who arranged it." Briar sat with that for a long moment. the fire painting shifting shadows across the cabin walls, her mind trying and failing to reconcile the man she'd spent 3 weeks tending with the title he'd just placed on his own shoulders, like a weight he'd been carrying silently the entire time. "The Alpha King," she repeated slowly. "I've been changing bandages on the Alpha King of Thornwick. You've been keeping the Alpha King of Thornwick alive," Ronan said, "which is a distinction that matters more than you might think, given how many people have profited from believing I was already dead. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because the moment you know who I am, you're no longer just a healer who found a wounded stranger in a river. You become someone who's been hiding a fugitive from Varric's regency, which under the laws he's rewritten in his own favor over the past 3 years, carries a punishment I'd rather not describe to you." His gray eyes held hers, steady and serious. "I wanted to give you as many days of simple ignorance as I could, before the truth put you in danger alongside me. That's a strange kind of kindness," Briar said. "Lying to protect someone from the consequences of the truth." "I didn't lie, I simply withheld." A faint, tired, almost smile. "I've had a great deal of practice telling the difference between the two, in circumstances where the distinction mattered a great deal." Briar stood, needing to move, needing her hands to do something other than sit uselessly in her lap while her mind reeled through everything this new information changed. She busied herself checking the fire, adding a log that didn't need adding, buying herself a few seconds to think. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her back still to him. "Now that I know, now you decide," Ronan said, "whether you want any further part of this. I can leave tonight, if that's what keeps you safest. Varric's men are searching the wrong villages for now, but that won't last forever, and I won't let my presence here be the reason harm comes to the one person who's shown me an ounce of decency in 3 years. Briar turned to face him, something steady settling in her chest despite the fear still humming underneath it. "If you leave tonight, in the condition you're in, you'll be dead again within a week. And this time, it'll actually be true. That's a risk I've already accepted." "Well, I haven't." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she watched something shift in his expression, surprise maybe, or something closer to gratitude. "I didn't drag you out of a river and spend 3 weeks keeping infection out of your ribs just to hand you back to it because things got complicated. You're not well enough to survive on your own yet, Ronan, or whatever I'm supposed to call you now. Alpha King or not, your body doesn't care about your titles. It cares about rest and clean wounds and food, and you're not getting enough of any of that on the run. You'd be risking everything to keep me here. I'm already risking everything. I decided that the morning I dragged you up the riverbank." She crossed the room and sat back down beside the bed, closer than strictly necessary, close enough that she could see the exhaustion still sitting heavy behind his eyes despite 3 weeks of healing. "Tell me the rest of it." "All of it. If I'm going to keep hiding an Alpha King in my cabin, I'd rather know exactly what I'm hiding him from." "So," he told her, "it took most of the night, the fire burning low and then being fed again." Briar listening without interrupting as Ronan laid out 3 years of betrayal in careful, measured pieces, the ambush orchestrated by his own second in command. A wolf named Cade, who'd been bought by Varric's promises long before anyone suspected his loyalty had shifted. The months of captivity in a remote holding meant to break him slowly rather than kill him outright, because a body could be produced and burned for the funeral pyre, but a missing king who might return someday was a threat that needed managing indefinitely, not eliminating quickly. "Why keep you alive at all?" Briar asked, somewhere past midnight, if killing you outright would have solved his problem faster. "Because Varric isn't stupid. Whatever else he is," Ronan said. "A dead king who's proven dead beyond doubt creates a clean succession. A missing king creates uncertainty that lingers, that makes other packs hesitate to fully commit to Varric's rule in case I ever resurface. He needed my death to look natural, accidental, mourned properly with a body everyone could see burn. Killing me quietly and disposing of the evidence would have left exactly the kind of uncertainty he couldn't afford. So instead, he kept me alive somewhere no one would think to look, waiting for the right moment to either produce a convincing corpse or simply let me die slowly enough that no one would ever connect the timing to anything suspicious. That's monstrous. That's politics, Ronan said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her he'd made his peace with that particular horror a long time ago. The way people make peace with things that would otherwise be unbearable to carry every day. I escaped 11 weeks ago. I've been moving since, trying to reach anyone from my old command structure who might still be loyal, anyone who could help me gather proof of the ambush before I try to reclaim anything. Varric's men found me 2 days before I ended up in your river. I don't fully remember the fight. I remember the water. I remember thinking I was probably going to die there, and being surprised at how little that frightened me compared to everything before it. Briar reached out, without entirely deciding to, and rested her hand over his where it lay against the blanket, and he didn't pull away. "You're not dying in my river," she said quietly. "Not tonight, and not on my watch." The weeks that followed took on a shape neither of them named out loud, though both of them noticed it happening. Ronan grew stronger, slowly, his ribs knitting properly, his color returning fully, until the day came when he could stand for a full hour without exhaustion pulling him back down. Briar taught him, without quite meaning to, how to be a person who wasn't running or fighting or calculating the next threat, and he taught her in turn, without quite meaning to either, what it felt like to have someone notice the small details of her day and ask about them like they mattered. "You favor your left hand when you're grinding herbs," he said one afternoon, watching her work at the small table by the window, "but you write with your right." My mother made me switch when I was young. Said a healer's dominant hand should be free for delicate work, not locked into a pestle. Briar didn't look up from the mortar. "You notice a lot of small things. Occupational habit. In my old life, the small details were usually the ones that got you killed if you missed them." He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands move. "It's strange, noticing things now because I want to, rather than because I have to." "Is that better? Or worse, better?" he said, without hesitation, and something in the certainty of it made her chest go warm in a way she wasn't fully prepared for. There were harder conversations, too, threaded through the easier ones. Ronan told her, in careful pieces over several nights, about the mother who'd raised him mostly alone after his father died young, a woman who'd taught him that an alpha's strength meant nothing if it wasn't paired with the discipline to use it carefully. He told her about Cade, the second in command who'd betrayed him, how the two of them had grown up together, trained together, and how the betrayal still sat in his chest sometimes like a physical wound that refused to fully close, worse in some ways than the ones she'd stitched. "I trusted him completely," Ronan said, staring into the fire one night, his voice low. "That's the part that still catches me sometimes, not the ambush itself. The years before it, all the moments I should have noticed something shifting in him and didn't, because I didn't want to believe the one person I trusted without question could be capable of it." "You couldn't have known," Briar said. "Betrayal only looks obvious afterward. In the moment, it just looks like someone you love." Is that experience talking, or philosophy? Briar considered lying, considered deflecting the way she usually did when the conversation turned toward her own past, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't want to. "My father left when I was 7, she said. "Not died. Left, just walked out one morning and never came back, and my mother spent years telling me it wasn't because of anything I'd done. and I spent years not quite believing her. She kept her eyes on the fire rather than on him. I learned early that the people who are supposed to stay sometimes don't, and the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes can't, and you just have to build a life around that fact instead of waiting for someone to prove it wrong. I'm sorry, Ronan said quietly. That's a hard thing to carry at 7. It's a hard thing to carry at any age. I just had an early start. She managed a small, tired smile. Is that why you told me the truth eventually, instead of just running the moment you were strong enough? Because you understood something about people who've been let down before? Partly, Ronan's gray eyes found hers, steady in the firelight. Mostly it's because I'd already decided, somewhere around the 2nd week, that you were the first person in 3 years I actually wanted to trust rather than simply needed to. Those aren't the same thing, Briar. I'd forgotten there was a difference until I woke up in your bed with a stranger's careful hands stitching my ribs and no idea yet what any of it would cost either of us. The moment stretched between them, warmer than the fire accounted for, and Briar felt something in her chest tilt dangerously toward a feeling she hadn't let herself have in longer than she could easily remember, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. You're an Alpha King, she said, mostly to remind herself of the practical impossibility of it. Whatever this is, whatever it's turning into, there's a whole territory out there that's going to have very strong opinions about who you're allowed to want. There's also a usurper sitting on a throne that isn't his, and a territory full of wolves who don't yet know their true king is alive, Ronan said. I'm not in a position to promise you an easy path, Briar. I can only promise you an honest one, for whatever that's worth to you. It's worth a great deal, she said, more than you'd probably guess. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and inside the small cabin 2 people who'd started as stranger and healer sat close enough that neither one moved away, both of them aware that whatever careful boundary they'd maintained for weeks had just quietly, irreversibly shifted. By late spring, Ronan had regained enough strength to help with the physical work around the cabin, though Briar noticed he was careful never to be seen doing it whenever anyone from the village came near. He chopped wood in the early mornings before anyone was likely to be walking the forest paths, mended the fence her mother had never quite gotten around to fixing, and moved through the cabin with a quiet competence that made the small space feel, for the first time since her mother's death, like a home rather than just a place she survived in. You're good with your hands, she told him one morning, watching him fit a new hinge onto the shutter that had been sagging for 2 years. I wouldn't have guessed that about an Alpha King. My mother believed a leader who couldn't do practical work with his own hands had no business commanding people who did nothing but practical work all day. He tested the hinge, satisfied when it swung smooth and silent. She used to say, if I couldn't fix a fence, I had no right asking a farmer to trust my judgment about his grazing rights. Smart woman. She was. Something wistful crossed his face. I think about what she'd say about all this. Sometimes. About Varric. About you. He glanced at her, something careful in his expression. I think she would have liked you a great deal, actually. She had very little patience for people who performed kindness for an audience. She would have recognized yours as the real thing immediately. Briar felt her face warm and busied herself with the bundle of dried lavender she'd been sorting, mostly to have somewhere else to look. You don't know that. I know it the way I know most things worth knowing. Slowly, and then all at once. He set down his tools and crossed the small distance between them, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. Briar, I need to say something, and I'd rather say it plainly than dance around it the way people in my old life always danced around anything that actually mattered. Her heart was doing something complicated and fast. Say it, then. I think I've loved you since roughly the 2nd week, when you caught me pacing at night and instead of scolding me properly, you sat me down by the fire and asked me to talk instead. I didn't recognize it as love at the time. I thought it was simply gratitude, or relief, or the particular attachment a person forms toward whoever saves their life. But it's grown into something considerably larger than any of those words account for, and I find I don't want to keep pretending otherwise, whatever complications it might bring to both our lives. Briar's hands had gone still around the lavender, her breath caught somewhere in her throat. Ronan, you don't have to answer right away. I know what I'm asking, or rather what I'm not asking, because I haven't got a throne to offer you yet, and I haven't got a safe territory to bring you into, and everything about loving me right now comes with considerable risk attached. His gray eyes held hers, steady despite the vulnerability underneath. I only wanted you to know the truth of it, the same way you've always insisted on knowing the truth of everything else. I love you too, Briar said, the words coming out simpler and steadier than she expected, given how complicated everything else about their situation remained. I think I've known it for a while now. Longer than I wanted to admit, honestly, because loving a fugitive alpha king with a usurper hunting him seemed like a spectacularly poor decision for someone who spent her whole life trying to be careful. And now? Now I've decided being careful was overrated, she said, and watched something in his face break open into an expression she hadn't seen on him before, unguarded and bright. The expression of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be told yes by someone who wanted nothing from him except exactly what he was offering in return. He kissed her then, gentle at first, careful in the way he was careful about everything since his recovery, like he was still testing what his body could handle, and then less careful as the moment deepened, one hand coming up to cradle the side of her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Ronan rested his forehead against hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, content to simply exist in the quiet certainty of what had just been spoken between them. This complicates everything, Briar said, eventually, though she was smiling when she said it. It does, Ronan agreed. I find I don't particularly mind. Outside, spring was fully arriving, the last frost gone from the ground, new growth pushing up through the soil in the small garden Briar tended, and inside the cabin, something new was also pushing its way up through ground that had lain fallow for a long time in both their lives, fragile and unfamiliar and entirely worth protecting. 3 days after that conversation, the trouble that had been circling at the edge of their small world finally arrived at the door itself. Briar heard the horses first, more than the 6 that had passed through the village weeks before, moving with a purpose that suggested they weren't asking questions this time so much as confirming an answer they'd already found. Ronan, her voice came out tighter than she meant it to. There are riders, a lot of them, coming down the forest road, and they're not slowing down like they're looking for a village to search. They're coming straight here. His face went through several expressions in quick succession, alarm, calculation, and then something that settled into grim resolve. Someone talked. Or someone was seen. It doesn't matter which now. What do we do? You do nothing, he said, already moving toward the door, his stance shifting into something Briar hadn't seen from him before, coiled and dangerous, every trace of the gentle man who'd fixed her shutters and kissed her by the fire replaced by something harder underneath. Whatever happens, Briar, you tell them you found me half-conscious and had no idea who I was. You tell them I threatened you into silence if you have to. Do not let them believe you knew. Do you understand me? Whatever loyalty exists between us, it does not extend to you sharing my punishment. I'm not lying about this. You will if it keeps you alive. The riders arrived before they could argue further, a dozen of them in Thornwick's black and silver, led by a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a captain's insignia who dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his hand already resting on the hilt of his sword. "We received word," the captain said, his eyes moving past Briar to fix on Ronan standing in the cabin doorway, "that a man matching a particular description had been seen in this area, a scar along the jaw. Considerable size." His gaze sharpened. "You'll forgive me for saying that description matches you rather closely." "Many men have scars, Captain," Ronan said, his voice carefully flat, stripped of any authority that might give him away. "I'm afraid you've ridden a long way for very little." The captain studied him a moment longer, and Briar's heart hammered against her ribs, certain the deception would collapse the moment the man looked closely enough, because there was something in the way Ronan stood, some old instinct of command he couldn't fully suppress even now, that seemed impossible for a trained soldier not to notice. "Bring him closer to the light," the captain said to one of his men. "I want a proper look at that scar." Ronan didn't move. "I'd rather you state your business plainly, Captain, than manhandle a healer's guest for no clear reason." "My business," the captain said, stepping closer himself rather than waiting for his subordinate, is confirming whether the rumors currently spreading through 3 villages about a resurrected king are true, or whether they're simply the fevered imagination of frightened farmers. His eyes narrowed on the scar along Ronan's jaw, and Briar watched the exact moment recognition crystallized into certainty. "Gods below. It's actually you." For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Then, the captain did something Briar hadn't expected at all. He dropped to one knee in the mud of her front yard, head bowed, and every soldier behind him followed suit with a speed that suggested none of them had needed convincing. "Alpha King," the captain said, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like relief. "We were told you were dead. Half the territory still mourns you, though I suspect Varric would prefer we'd stopped mourning considerably sooner." Ronan's whole body had gone very still, his gray eyes moving over the kneeling soldiers with an expression Briar couldn't quite read, caution warring visibly with something that might have been hope. "You didn't come here to arrest me," he said slowly. "We came here to confirm the rumor before deciding what to do about it," the captain said, rising, though his men remained kneeling behind him. "My name is Garrick. I served under your command during the border campaigns 3 years back, before everything fell apart. I never believed the official account of your death sat right, Alpha King. Too convenient. Too quick a funeral for a body that supposedly needed identifying from battle wounds." His jaw tightened. "There are more of us than Varric realizes who never stopped questioning what happened out there. If you're truly alive, and truly willing to reclaim what's yours, you'll find more support waiting than his spies have accounted for." Briar let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, watching relief and disbelief move across Ronan's face in equal measure, watching 3 years of careful, exhausted survival finally crack open into something that might, at long last, be an actual path forward rather than simply another threat to outrun. Garrick and his men stayed only long enough to share what they knew, which turned out to be more than Ronan had dared hope for during 3 years of exile. Discontent with Varric's regency had been growing steadily, quiet at first, whispered between soldiers who remembered a different kind of leadership, then bolder as Varric's policies grew harsher, his taxes heavier, his patience for dissent thinner with each passing season. "He's consolidated power faster than anyone expected," Garrick said, standing in Briar's small kitchen with a mug of tea he seemed uncertain what to do with, unused to the domesticity of it after years of army rations. "But consolidation built on fear doesn't hold the same way loyalty does. Half my company would turn the moment they had proof you were alive and asking for their support. The other half would need convincing. But convincing is possible. given time and the right approach. "How much time?" Ronan asked, "before Varric learns I've resurfaced?" "Less than you'd like. Rumors already reached 3 villages before we did. If we heard them, his spies did too." Garrick's expression turned grim. "I'd guess days. Not weeks, before he moves to either silence the rumor or silence you directly, whichever seems more achievable to him first." After the soldiers left, riding back the way they'd come with instructions to gather what quiet support they could without tipping their hand too early, Ronan stood at Briar's window for a long time, watching the empty road, his expression unreadable. "You're thinking about leaving," Briar said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "I'm thinking about what leaving means for you, if I stay here waiting instead." He turned to face her, gray eyes serious. "The moment Varric confirms I'm alive, this cabin becomes the most dangerous place in the territory to be found. He'll send more than a search party next time. He'll send people meant to make sure the rumor dies along with everyone who might have helped it spread." "Then we don't wait here," Briar said. "We go to wherever the fight actually needs to happen." "Briar, this isn't your fight." "You washed up in my river," she said, more sharply than she intended, though she didn't soften it. "You bled in my bed. You told me you loved me 3 days ago, standing in my garden with dirt still on your hands from fixing my fence. I don't know exactly when this stopped being just your fight and started being mine too, but I know it happened, and I'm not interested in being protected out of the ending just because the ending might be dangerous." Something in Ronan's face shifted, the careful protectiveness giving way to something more like respect, though the worry didn't fully leave his eyes. "If you come with me," he said slowly, "there's no guarantee of safety. Varric's people are ruthless, and they will use anyone close to me as leverage the moment they understand what you mean to me. I understand that, and if this fails, if Varric's hold on the territory proves stronger than the discontent Garrick described, we could both end up exactly where I nearly ended up 3 years ago. Or worse. I understand that too." Briar took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, steady despite the fear humming underneath her calm. "I spent my whole life being careful, Ronan, careful with my heart, careful with my trust, careful never to want anything badly enough that losing it would break me. I dragged a half-drowned stranger out of a river because some part of me decided, before I even knew why, that being careful wasn't going to be enough anymore. I'm not changing my mind now that the stakes are higher. If anything, that makes the choice clearer, not harder." Ronan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers the way he had after their first kiss, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the quiet cabin that had sheltered them both through the slow work of healing, neither one speaking, both of them aware that whatever came next would test everything they'd built in these stolen weeks of safety. "Then, we go together," he said finally, "but we go carefully, and we go with a plan, not just courage. Courage alone got me left for dead in a river once already. I'd rather not test its limits a second time without something more substantial standing behind it." "What kind of plan?" Garrick mentioned a gathering, 3 days from now, at a mill on the eastern border where several of the discontented captains have been meeting quietly under the pretense of grain trade negotiations. If I appear there, in person, with proof of who I am and what happened to me, it becomes considerably harder for Varric to dismiss the rumors as farmers' fever dreams. His jaw set with new determination. It's a risk. But it's the kind of risk that might actually end this, rather than simply postponing the inevitable confrontation for another few months of running. Briar nodded, already turning her mind toward practical matters, what to pack, what supplies they'd need for the journey, how to move safely through territory that had suddenly become far more dangerous than the quiet forest paths she'd known her whole life. Then, we leave at first light, she said. And Ronan? Whatever happens at that mill, I'm glad I pulled you out of that river. I'd do it again, every time, even knowing everything I know now. The journey to the eastern mill took 2 full days, moving carefully along back roads and forest trails that Briar knew from a lifetime of gathering herbs in every corner of the territory, avoiding the main routes where Varric's patrols were most active. Ronan's strength held better than either of them expected. Though Briar caught him favoring his healing ribs on the second day, a tightness around his eyes he tried and failed to hide from her. "We can rest," she said, when they stopped to water their single borrowed horse at a stream crossing. "You don't need to push through pain to prove anything to me." "I'm not proving anything to you," he said, though his breathing had gone shallow in a way that told her otherwise. "I'm trying to prove something to myself, I think. That 3 years of captivity and a knife wound didn't take away the parts of me that used to matter." "They didn't," Briar said simply. "But you don't have to prove that by breaking yourself open again before we even reach the mill. There's a difference between strength and stubbornness, Ronan, and I've watched you confuse the two more than once since I pulled you out of that river." He managed a tired laugh at that, low and genuine. "You're the only person alive who talks to me like that. Everyone else either bowed to my title or feared my authority enough to soften every observation into something more comfortable. I never much cared about your title," Briar said. "I cared about keeping you alive first, and now I care about keeping the man underneath the title, which as far as I can tell requires occasionally telling him things he doesn't want to hear." They reached the mill as dusk settled over the eastern border, a sturdy stone building beside a wide, slow river, smoke rising from its chimney. Several horses tied outside that Briar recognized as belonging to soldiers rather than simple grain merchants. Garrick met them at the door, his expression tight with the particular strain of a man who'd spent 2 days convincing skeptical allies of something that sounded, even to him, almost too good to be believable. "They're inside," he said quietly. 4 captains, representing roughly 1/3 of the standing garrison between them. "They're willing to listen, Alpha King, but willing to listen and willing to commit their companies to open rebellion against Varric are 2 very different things. You'll need to convince them of considerably more than just your survival." Ronan nodded, squaring his shoulders in a way that made him look, for the first time since Briar had pulled him from the river, like the king his title claimed him to be rather than simply a wounded man recovering in her cabin. Inside, 4 captains sat around a rough wooden table, their expressions ranging from cautious hope to open suspicion. And the moment Ronan stepped fully into the lamplight, Briar watched all 4 of them go very still, recognition moving across their faces in ways that couldn't be faked or performed. "It's really you," one of them said finally, an older woman with gray streaking her dark hair, her voice unsteady. "I served under your father before you. I never believed the official account of your death, not fully, but I confess I never expected to see confirmation with my own eyes." "I understand your skepticism," Ronan said, his voice carrying the same measured authority Briar had glimpsed occasionally during his recovery, now fully present without the exhaustion dulling it. 3 years ago, I was ambushed on the northern border by my own second in command, acting on Varric's orders, and left for dead in a manner designed to look like an accident during routine patrol. I survived, barely, and spent 2 years in a location I still don't fully understand the geography of, kept alive because a confirmed corpse creates clean succession, while a merely missing king creates the kind of lingering uncertainty Varric couldn't risk having exploited by rival claimants. He laid out the details methodically, the same account he'd given Briar over several careful nights, but delivered now with the precision of a man accustomed to presenting evidence to skeptical audiences, watching each captain's face for the moment doubt gave way to conviction. Why now? The oldest captain asked when Ronan finished. Why resurface after 3 years of silence, rather than simply staying hidden and safe? Because staying hidden means Varric continues ruling a territory he stole through betrayal and murder, and every season that passes makes his grip harder to break, Ronan said. And because I met someone during my recovery who reminded me that hiding safely while others suffer under an illegitimate ruler isn't actually the same thing as survival. It's simply a slower kind of surrender. Briar felt her chest tighten at that, watching him glance toward her briefly before returning his full attention to the captains. And she understood, with a clarity that settled deep and warm despite the danger still surrounding them, exactly how much this moment had cost him to reach, and exactly how much courage it had taken to arrive here at all. The captains talked long into the night, questions turning over every angle of Ronan's account, testing details against their own memories of the border campaign, the funeral, the early days of Varric's regency. Briar sat quietly near the fire, watching the slow, careful process of trust being rebuilt piece by piece, admiring the patience Ronan showed even as exhaustion crept back into his posture with each passing hour. By the time the captains finally agreed to commit their companies, cautiously, conditionally, but genuinely, the night had turned properly dark, and Ronan looked ready to collapse from the effort of holding himself upright through hours of careful diplomacy. You need rest, Briar said, once the captains had retired to their own quarters within the mill, leaving Ronan and Briar alone by the dying fire. You pushed yourself too hard today. I had to, he said, though he sank gratefully into the chair beside her, his shoulders finally allowed to slump. Every hour I spend recovering is an hour Varric spends consolidating further, or worse, an hour closer to his people discovering exactly where I've resurfaced. I know. I'm not arguing you shouldn't have done it. I'm just telling you that you can rest now, for tonight at least, and let your body catch up with everything your will has been demanding of it. He reached for her hand in the firelight, his grip warm and steady despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming with me. For all of it. I don't think I fully understood before tonight how much different this felt with someone beside me who wanted nothing from the outcome except my survival. You're not alone in this anymore, Briar said. Whatever happens next, we face it together. They didn't have long to rest. Word arrived before dawn, carried by a breathless rider who'd pushed his horse hard through the night, that Varric's spies had confirmed the rumors of Ronan's survival, and that a company of soldiers loyal to the regent was already moving toward the eastern border, faster than anyone had anticipated, determined to silence the threat before it could gather further momentum. How many? Ronan asked, already moving to gather what few belongings they'd brought, his exhaustion visibly pushed aside by the immediate necessity of action. 2 full companies, the rider said, still catching his breath. Under Varric's personal command. He's not sending subordinates this time. He's coming himself, which either means he's supremely confident of victory or supremely desperate to end this before it spreads any further. Garrick appeared in the doorway, already dressed for battle, his expression grim but resolute. We have perhaps 6 hours before they reach the mill, Alpha King. Enough time to position our people, but not enough time to gather significantly more support before the confrontation happens. Then 6 hours will have to be enough, Ronan said, and Briar watched the transformation happen in real time. The careful, healing man she'd nursed back to health, giving way fully to the king who'd once commanded armies, decisive and steady despite the danger closing in around them. The preparations that followed moved with the particular efficiency of people who understood exactly how little time remained. Captains dispatched messengers to rally the companies who'd pledged tentative support, positioning them along the approaches to the mill in formations designed to make Varric's numerical advantage matter less than it should have. Briar found herself pressed into service as well, her knowledge of herbs and healing suddenly invaluable as soldiers began preparing for a confrontation that would inevitably leave wounded in its wake. "You should stay back," Ronan said, finding her a quiet moment before the fighting began in earnest, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the armor and weapons surrounding them both. "Whatever happens today, I need you safe." "I'm not hiding while you fight for your life," Briar said. "I'll stay back from the actual combat, I promise you that much, but I'll be close enough to treat the wounded the moment they need it, yours included if it comes to that." "It's not going to come to that. You don't know that." Her voice caught slightly, fear finally breaking through the calm she'd maintained through the long night of preparation. "Ronan, please, just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you didn't survive 3 years of captivity and a knife wound in my river just to die reclaiming a throne on the very day you finally had a reason to want to live." Something in his expression softened, the fierce determination giving way briefly to the same vulnerability she'd first glimpsed weeks ago, when he'd woken confused and afraid in her cabin bed. "I promise you," he said, "that I intend to survive this, if only because I've found something on the other side of it worth surviving for." He kissed her once, fierce and brief, and then turned to join Garrick and the assembled captains, and Briar watched him go with her heart hammering against her ribs, praying to whatever gods might be listening that the promise he'd just made would prove easier to keep than either of them fully believed. The battle for the Eastern Mill began just past midday, Varric's forces arriving in tight formation along the main road, banners of black and silver flying stiff in the wind. Ronan positioned himself at the center of the defensive line, visible deliberately, a calculated risk meant to prove beyond any doubt to the approaching soldiers exactly who they'd be fighting against, and whether their loyalty truly belonged to the man giving them orders. Briar watched from the mill's upper floor, her healing supplies laid out and ready, her heart in her throat as the two forces closed the distance between them. She could see Varric himself now, riding at the front of his column, a lean man with cold, calculating eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of every description Ronan had given her over their weeks together. "Stand down," Varric called out, his voice carrying easily across the field, "and I'll consider mercy for the fools who've been convinced to follow a dead man's ghost." "I'm not a ghost, cousin," Ronan called back, his voice carrying the same authority Briar had witnessed at the captain's meeting, steady and unafraid despite the numbers arrayed against him. "I'm considerably more alive than you'd prefer, and I have 3 years of evidence documenting exactly how you arranged that inconvenience for yourself." Something rippled through Varric's assembled soldiers at that, uncertainty spreading through their ranks in a way that Briar could see even from her distant vantage point, and she understood, watching it happen, exactly what Garrick had meant about loyalty built on fear cracking the moment genuine doubt found purchase. "He's lying," Varric shouted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Whoever this imposter is, he's clearly been coached by whatever conspiracy is trying to destabilize my rightful regency." "Ask Cade," Ronan called back, assuming you haven't already had him quietly removed now that his usefulness has ended. "He led the ambush personally, on your explicit orders. He knows exactly what happened on that northern border 3 years ago, and I suspect his loyalty to you has grown considerably thinner now that the risk of exposure has become real." The uncertainty in Varric's ranks deepened visibly, soldiers exchanging glances, several lowering their weapons slightly as doubt took firmer hold, and Briar watched Varric's expression shift from cold confidence into something closer to genuine alarm as he realized how quickly his support was eroding in real time. The fighting that followed was brief and chaotic rather than the extended battle Briar had feared, entire sections of Varric's forces defecting the moment it became clear their commander's authority was crumbling rather than holding. Briar lost sight of Ronan in the confusion, her heart hammering with a fear so complete it felt like drowning. And she forced herself to focus on the wounded already being carried toward her makeshift healing station rather than dwelling on possibilities too terrible to consider. It was nearly an hour before she saw him again, moving through the aftermath with Garrick at his side, both of them bearing the marks of combat but neither seriously wounded. And the relief that flooded through her nearly buckled her knees. "Varric," she asked, the moment he was close enough to hear her, "what happened to him?" "Captured," Ronan said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something like disbelief at how quickly the confrontation had resolved itself. The moment his own soldiers began defecting, his personal guard made the calculation that protecting him further wasn't worth the risk to their own lives. He'll face a proper trial, with all the evidence I've gathered over 3 years finally presented before witnesses who can judge it fairly, rather than the kind of quiet disappearance he arranged for me. Briar reached for him, and he pulled her close despite the blood and dirt covering both of them, holding her tightly enough that she felt the tremor still running through his body, the aftermath of adrenaline and fear finally catching up now that the immediate danger had passed. "You kept your promise," she said quietly, her face pressed against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady gradually beneath her ear. "You survived. I told you I had something worth surviving for," Ronan said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "I meant it, Briar, every word of it." Around them, the mill and its surroundings gradually settled into the particular quiet that follows a battle's end, wounded being tended, prisoners being secured, and somewhere in the chaos, word already beginning to spread through the assembled soldiers and villagers who'd gathered to watch, that the Alpha King of Thornwick, presumed dead for 3 years, had returned to reclaim what had always rightfully belonged to him. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of transition, the territory reorganizing itself around a truth most had believed impossible only a season before. Varric's trial proceeded with the full weight of evidence Ronan had spent 3 years gathering. Testimony from soldiers who'd witnessed the ambush's aftermath, records that had survived despite attempts to destroy them, and finally, most damning of all, a confession from Cade himself, who'd chosen cooperation over the fate awaiting a man who'd betrayed his king for a regent whose own position had just collapsed entirely. Ronan's return to the capital was nothing like the quiet, careful life they'd built together in Briar's cabin. Crowds gathered along every road, wolves who remembered their true king kneeling and weeping openly at his passage, the weight of 3 years of mourning finally lifting into something like collective relief. Briar found herself swept into the transition alongside him, uncertain of her place in a world so far removed from herbalism and quiet forest paths, though Ronan never once let her doubt where he wanted her standing. "You belong beside me," he told her, the night before his formal reinstatement as Alpha King, both of them standing on a balcony overlooking a capital city Briar had never seen before. Her life became tangled with his. Not as an afterthought to the throne's requirements, but as the reason I still had something worth fighting to reclaim it for. "Your advisors will have opinions about that," Briar said, watching lights flicker across the city below, still adjusting to the scale of everything now surrounding her. A healer with no pack rank, no noble blood, becoming the Alpha King's chosen mate. "My advisors can have whatever opinions they like," Ronan said. "I spent 3 years being told by circumstance exactly who I was supposed to trust, and exactly what I was supposed to want, and every single one of those assumptions nearly got me killed. I'm done letting anyone else decide who deserves my loyalty and my heart, Briar. That decision belongs to me, and I've already made it. The formal ceremony marking his return to the throne was grand in a way that still felt slightly unreal to Briar. Hundreds of wolves gathered in the same great hall where Ronan's mother had once ruled beside his father, banners restored to their proper colors. The black and silver that had come to represent Varric's regency replaced by the deep green and gold that had marked Thornwick's throne for generations before the ambush that nearly ended everything. Ronan found her in the crowd during the ceremony's quieter moments, pulling her gently aside into a private alcove where the noise of celebration faded into something more intimate. "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his tone made Briar's heart quicken, recognizing the particular seriousness that had settled over his features. "Not tonight, in front of all of them, because I think you deserve better than a proposal performed for an audience of nobles who barely know your name yet. But soon, Briar. I intend to ask you soon, and I wanted you to know it was coming, so the asking itself wouldn't catch you entirely by surprise." "I think I've suspected as much," Briar said, smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Since roughly the moment you told the captains at that mill that you'd met someone during your recovery who reminded you what surviving was actually for. Was I that obvious?" Completely, she reached up to touch the scar along his jaw, the one she'd first noticed while pulling him from the river, now familiar under her fingers in a way that felt like coming home rather than remembering danger. "For what it's worth, whenever you do ask, the answer is already decided. I decided it somewhere around the 3rd week, watching you fix my shutters at dawn so nobody from the village would see you doing it. The proposal came 3 weeks later. In the garden behind the capital's main hall, rather than any formal setting, Ronan kneeling in the dirt among the early roses just beginning to bloom, no advisors present, no ceremony beyond the two of them, and the quiet certainty that had grown steadily between them since the morning she'd found him half drowned in her river. "I once told you," he said, taking her hands in his, "that everyone in my old life wanted something from me, that nobody offered kindness without calculating what they'd get in return. You proved that wrong the moment you decided to save a stranger's life without knowing anything about him except that he was drowning and needed help. I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving to you, every single day, that I understand exactly what that kindness was worth, and that I'll never take it for granted." "Ronan Ashvale," Briar said, her voice unsteady with happiness. "Are you asking me to marry you, or simply delivering another speech about gratitude?" He laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way she'd rarely heard from him even in their most private moments together. "Marry me, Briar, be my queen, my mate, and whatever other title the advisors insist on adding to it, though none of those titles will ever matter to me nearly as much as the simple fact of you choosing to stay." "Yes," she said, pulling him up from the dirt to kiss him properly, the roses blooming around them and the capital city humming with life beyond the garden walls. "Yes, to all of it, though I reserve the right to keep fixing shutters at dawn whenever I feel like it, king or not." "I wouldn't dream of stopping you," Ronan said against her lips, and somewhere beyond the garden, Thornwick continued its slow, steady recovery from 3 years of stolen rule, guided now by a king who'd learned, in the quietest and most unlikely of places, exactly what was worth fighting to protect. Later that evening, after the garden had emptied and the last of the wedding preparations had been discussed with an overwhelmed and delighted staff, Briar found herself standing alone for a moment on the same balcony where Ronan had first told her she belonged beside him. The capital spread out below, lights flickering on one by one as the sun dropped behind the western hills, and she thought of the small cabin at the edge of Thornwick's forest, the river that had carried a dying stranger to her door, the slow, unlikely weeks that had turned a healer's quiet solitude into something she'd never once let herself imagine wanting. Ronan found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting against the top of her head in a gesture that had become familiar in the months since his recovery began. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, softly. "About any of it? Only that I didn't find you sooner," Briar said, leaning back into him. "Though I suppose the river brought you exactly when it needed to." "Then I'm grateful to the river," Ronan said, "and considerably more grateful to the woman who refused to let a stranger drown simply because helping him seemed dangerous." Below them, the city settled into evening, and above them, the first stars emerged over a territory finally, fully at peace, its true king restored not through conquest alone, but through the quiet, stubborn kindness of a woman who had once decided, on an ordinary gray morning by an ordinary slow river, that some strangers were simply worth the risk of saving, whatever came after.